to everyone listening. My name is Rebecca. I'm the content director at Build Visible. Today, this is our first webinar that we've ever done as an agency, and it's something that we're going to be doing a lot more of. So today I'm going to be talking about how to get buy-in for content budget if you manage content in-house of any kind. So this is mainly for in-house marketers, but if you're from agency side, it should still be useful to you because a lot of the principles go across as well. So in terms of questions, I believe the chat is disabled, but there's a Q&A section. So if you have questions that you want to ask throughout, you can just ask your questions there and then they will be sent through to us. I've got Olivia, one of our consultants here with me, who's going to be filtering those questions, and we'll go through all of those at the end. I think we already have a couple that have been sent in already as well, so I can answer any queries that you have later on. So let me open up the deck and we can get going. So the reason that we picked this topic to talk about as our first webinar, getting buy-in for content, is because, especially on the content side, this is an issue that we see a fair amount. So hopefully you can see on the screen there now that I've begun the presentation. And I'm going to be talking through, if you're developing a proposal at the moment, and you're looking to get further investment for content within your business, how exactly you can go about doing that. Oh, wait a minute, I don't think. 1 second. Here we go. Let me just share the deck properly. There, and that should be visible to everyone now. So let me start again. So yeah, the reason that we're talking about this is it's one of the questions that we get quite a lot from in-house marketers, especially if they own content. They find it very difficult compared to other marketing investments to get real investment in content that's going to be able to make a difference within the business. That's something that we help our clients with quite a lot. We've had quite a lot of experience of kind of working with senior marketers like CMOs to kind of understand how and where to invest in content. So today I'm just going to be going through 4 core areas that you should have in any proposal. So let's begin. So broadly, I'm going to be using this time to talk about how to get your boss to give you more budget. That sounds quite crass, but I do think it's really important that as marketers, we're making money for our brands, and that does mean getting real investment. So I don't think we should really shy away from kind of talking about budgets or the fact that we need more budget or that we need more investment. So I'm going to run through 4 core areas of focus for you to consider within any budget proposal that is requesting content, which I'll run through now, and then we'll go into each area in a little bit more depth. In terms of how much time you're going to be taking out for this webinar, it should be no more than about 20 minutes or so, so it will be fairly concise. I'm not going to be waffling on. And there will be time at the end for questions as well, as I mentioned. So in terms of what I'm going to be covering, the first thing, and to me, I think the most important thing that I'm going to be talking through is robust data. So we work very closely with our analytics team here to make sure that as a content team, we have the data that we need to be able to prove the worth of any content that we create. So that's something that I'll be talking about initially. The second thing is clarity, which I think is really important when it comes to talking about content and budget for content, because, I mean, the nature of even the word content is very broad, like it just kind of means stuff. Like content could be a product description, it could be a television advert, it could be a video that goes on a site, it could be an image. So I do understand how to senior marketers, when they kind of have people coming to them asking for content budget, it's a bit like, well, what the hell is that? So we'll spend a little bit of time just distilling that and making sure that we really understand what we're talking about when we're talking about content. Thirdly, control. This is something really simple that we find really useful, which is essentially asking the right questions of the budget owner before you go in with your proposal. Often what we find with clients is that they've gone and asked for budget and they've got a no straight away and they're not really sure why. The important thing is you should actually know where you're going to get pushback and why before you even put your proposal forward. And fourthly, I'm going to be talking about collaboration. So obviously the nature of the content beast is that you're basically going to have to work with pretty much everyone in the business to get things live, from developers to SEOs to creative teams. So just talking a little bit about kind of how to make sure that that's going to work as smoothly as possible. So To start, leading with measurement and tailoring your analytics. So the key thing to remember is that most out-of-the-box analytics setups are not sufficient for measuring the value of content. So at the moment, if you have Google Analytics or something similar set up, and you haven't had an analyst actually come in and look at your analytics and tailor it with specific goals that are designed to measure content, you are not yet at a point where you can truly measure the value of content. So I'll talk through that now so you kind of understand broadly what that means. In terms of how you need to think about your data, this is something that our head of analytics put together in terms of how clients or kind of brand analysts should understand their data. So you've got integrity. So essentially, can you actually trust your data? Does it make sense? And then relevance. So that's when we get closer to measuring the things that we really want to know. So this is where most brands are. This is out of the box implementation. So hopefully you have analytics set up, which means that you'll be here. So essentially you'll have accurate data that you can trust, but it won't give you a great deal of meaningful insight. So at the moment, for example, you may be able to measure things like views or like bounce rate, but you won't really be able to measure how someone is truly engaging with a piece of content. So for example, is someone coming and reading a blog post and then moving from a blog post through to a guide? If someone reads a guide, are they more likely to convert versus someone who goes straight to a product page from search, something like that? So I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second, but where you are now, you won't have any of that real understanding. You'll kind of just be able to understand basic on-page metrics. Then you've got here, which is basically, this means that things are a bit of a mess. So you'll have legacy implementation. Often you do find with analytics platforms, if teams have changed around quite a lot, if you've had different developers kind of going in and out and making changes, things can get incredibly messy, and you can get to the point with your analytics where it's not actually trustworthy anymore. So the data isn't relevant, and it's also not trustworthy enough to tell you that much about your on-site content. Then you will have a lot of people, we do find are here. So they have definitely made an effort to go in and kind of put together a good measurement strategy. Meaningful KPIs are definitely in place, but technical issues obscure insight. So again, that's just where you need an analytics consultant to kind of get involved to make sure that your goals are tracking properly so that you can trust your data, and ultimately you want to be here. So before you're putting together any kind of robust content proposal, the first thing that I would do is go and build a relationship with your analytics team and understand exactly what data you're tracking at the moment in relation to the performance of your content. And if you're sitting here, so if you have relevant data that is going to be meaningful to you to help you understand how your content is performing, and can you actually trust that data? Have the goals been set up properly? Is your analytics technically sound, essentially? So where you want to be is in a place where you can answer questions like this. Which funnel stages have been defined and which KPIs are being measured for each funnel stage? What's the impact of passive interaction? So this one's really, really interesting. We do find a lot of brands, for example, will understand how many people have watched a video, how many people have read a review, or how many people have read a guide. But they don't necessarily understand what the long-term impact of that interaction has been. So what you want is not necessarily to know how many people have watched a video on your site, but how have they acted post watching that video? And is their behavior any more likely to, or are they any more likely to convert than someone who hasn't watched that video? And that's where you get really close to revenue, and it's far easier for you to get the investment that you need in content. What engagement metrics have been configured? So again, that kind of means beyond things just like dwell time. So really understanding how a consumer is moving through a page, what parts of the page they're interacting with, and how you can feed that into your content strategy. This is something that we work on a lot. So how is editorial content driving product or category page clicks and therefore contributing to revenue? So as you can see, that the deeper that you get with analytics, it's more about connecting the dots between content that isn't necessarily completely product focused and product focused content, which then drives revenue. It's all about connecting the dots between those two things so you can get the investment that you need. And finally, and probably most importantly, how is all this information being fed back to content creators? So you do find sometimes with brands that they will have really amazing data that's been set up by the analytics team. You've got brilliant tracking, but the communication lines between the production house and the analytics team aren't necessarily as close as they could be. So it's just really important to make sure that if you do have those two teams in place, communications are running smoothly, basically. So the next thing is back to clarity. So it's essentially how you're thinking about content and how you're talking about content. So this webinar is actually off the back of a talk that I did a couple of weeks ago at a conference called DMWF. And this part was something that really did ring true with quite a lot of people. So for that talk, I did an additional bit of research around how people write about and suggest measuring the performance of content, which again, let's clarify, is a massive, quite meaningless word. So I had a look at a few articles for that talk, and I jotted down the different metrics that people in different industries were suggesting when they were writing about measuring content. And this is like a handful of what I found. So you've got rankings, on-page engagement, likes, links, social mentions, AV, unbranded visibility. Like there's a very, very broad amount of metrics out there that people are suggesting for like, this is how you measure content. I think the matter of the fact is that everyone's very desperate for content to work. Like it's something that we all really enjoy doing. Everyone enjoys creating content. It's very fun, especially if you work in a brand. You want to be able to go out and take photos and develop video content and write creative copy, because that's usually the part of our jobs that we all love. But it's kind of got to the point where within the industry, we're tailoring really convoluted measurement plans to individual pieces of content, and we're putting a hell of a lot of pressure on like a guide or a webinar or something like that to try and make it work. We've started allocating budget to content in its own right, unrelated to the channels that it's supposed to service, which is where we're kind of tripping ourselves up, and it's starting to not make sense. This is part of what's beginning to confuse CMOs. Like they'll have given out budget to social, to SEO, and then they're also asked for content budget as well, and it's very confusing. So I'm going to look into why that doesn't really work. So if we go back to this list of metrics that I found, and we have a deeper look at them, you can see that with the KPIs here, these aren't content KPIs at all. These are very much SEO KPIs. These are PR KPIs. These are social KPIs. This is how you should be measuring social, not content. So none of the KPIs really that I found were anything unique, specific, or original. And that is because content should always be designed to service an existing channel. Content is not a channel of its own, and we shouldn't treat it as a channel of its own, and it shouldn't have a budget of its own. Budget should only be allocated to content when your forecasting and your strategy proves that one of your channels is going to be improved with quality content. Content isn't a strategy, content is a tactic. So, secondly, I'll be going on to asking the right questions. So this is something that I found really useful, and to be honest, it's going to sound a little bit basic, and it always does sound a bit obvious when you start talking about it. But I do think it's really important to get to know the person that you're sending your brief to, particularly when it comes to content. I think you need to get all of the difficult questions out of the way before you go asking for budget, before you submit your proposal. So I'm going to give you an example of a few of the questions that we typically ask people when we're putting together like a pitch or a proposal for a brand to help them get more investment in content. The first one is around reservations. So really understanding what's stopped people from investing in content up until this point, what makes them feel nervous about content in general, and making sure that we understand all the reservations head on so that we can address those in a proposal. Usually it will come down to things like being able to see a return on investment. That's usually the reservation that we get people coming back to us with. which is a really easy one to tackle, because then obviously we can go with a very heavy analytics-based proposal, so they really know that they're going to understand how pieces of content are performing. What does your ideal proposal look like? I always find this one really interesting, because I always like to go in very data-led with proposals and help people understand how things are going to be measured and how they're going to be able to understand performance. But we recently had a meeting with someone and we were like, right, we're putting together your proposal. What do you want to see? And she was literally just like, I just care about the creative. Like, all I want to see is ideas, which, to be honest, like, did baffle me a bit. But it's always really good to understand whether you're talking to someone with a more creative mind or whether you're talking to someone who's very ROI focused, and what kind of marketer is that you are pitching to. What does your ideal report look like? This is really going to help you kind of understand where their head is at in terms of measurement. So if they come back to you with things like, I want to see things like views and page views and bounce rate, then you know that you can go in with a really strong proposal on the analytics side, because you can get that content performance reporting set up, so you can almost go and one-up them there. Hopefully they'll be quite enlightened and they'll want to be seeing more than that, so they'll be asking you for things like revenue, and that's where it can get really interesting. And this is another really interesting question to ask the budget holder. So if you don't invest in content, where is the budget going to be spent? And are you going to be up against channels which are more kind of directly performance led, like PPC or display, or are they going to be investing in like media spend, that kind of thing, or is it going to be spent in traditional advertising? It's just good to know exactly where that budget's going to go if it's not going to be coming your way. So, and the final part is dispelling concerns about sign-off as early on as possible. So the reason that I'm including this section, I didn't actually do this in my talk a couple of weeks ago, is because a lot of the issues typically that we see coming up, or a lot of the resistance that people get from CMOs or content or marketing directors, is that they are reluctant to invest in content because of the mess it's going to create, basically. So you'll have many different teams involved in content creation, in terms of the approval, in terms of putting it live, and in terms of getting it created. That's quite daunting for someone who's going to be investing in content, because from their perspective, what they can see is a black hole of time. Basically, they can just see lots of different people on their team having to invest lots of time in creating something that they're not actually sure about in terms of whether it's going to work. So typically this is like a pool of some of the teams that are probably going to be involved in content creation. So lots of different teams with lots of different types of personalities there. You've got brand, creative, PR, and social, who are all going to have their own kind of perspectives on content and content creation. So it's going to be really important, particularly I'd say, to speak to brand and PR. Firstly, to see how they can help you and make sure that any content you're creating is on brand, to see if PR can do anything to help you in terms of getting that content promoted. Then you've got CRM and UX. So again, UX in particular are a team that should definitely be involved in any content creation if it's going to be on site. So for example, you might be an SEO manager who is creating a page to rank for SEO purposes, but there should definitely be user experience considerations as well. So how are you going to make sure that you're pulling that team into the fold? And then you have SEO, dev, analytics, again, three teams that are really vital. So if you are a PR manager and you are creating a campaign page for a campaign that you have going live, how are you getting SEO involved? How are you getting analytics involved to help you do some of that really insightful content tracking that I was talking about? So essentially with all of these teams, everyone kind of needs to be talking to each other. And I think before you put your proposal together, it's really important to map out which teams you think you're going to be working with and how. Including collaboration and sign-off plans with contributions from those teams within your proposal is something that we know senior marketers find very reassuring within proposals. So for example, if you can go to PR and build out a collaboration plan, or go to SEO and build out a collaboration plan, and actually have their investment in your proposal before you go to the senior manager, that's something that's really going to help push forward your proposal and get your budget signed off. So thank you very much. That was it, nice and brief, as I promised. So I think there are a couple of questions which I'll go into now. But if you have to rush off or you didn't want to ask your question within this webinar, my email address is there. I'm happy to chat anytime. I find this stuff really interesting, so please do feel free to get in touch, or you can tweet me as well. Another quick thing to mention is that if you were interested in the analytics performance stuff that I was talking about at the beginning, our next webinar is being run by our analytics team, and it's actually going to be on how to effectively measure content performance. So that first section of the webinar there, it's basically going to be a built out version of that, going into far more detail than I did because they're the experts. It's on the 17th of July at 3 p.m. But if you sign up to the Book Visible mailing list, you'll get an email or something about that at some point anyway. So questions wise.
Yeah, we've got a couple of questions. So firstly, what do you usually track in terms of performance?
Okay, so in terms of how we usually track content performance or the performance of an individual piece of content, if we're talking about on-site content, we obviously always try to get as close to revenue as we possibly can. So going back to that first section of the webinar, the analytics section, and answering all those questions around the value of an engagement. So what we always try to do is not just look at there were X amount of engagements. It's always about, and what exactly has that meant to the business and what's happened next. So essentially we try and get as close to revenue as possible by understanding how consumers are using content on a website to make purchasing decisions.
We also have another question, which is what would your recommendation be if you don't have an analytics team in-house?
Cool. So that was, what would your recommendation be if you don't have an analytics team in-house? Obviously, if you are a smaller brand, it is likely that you won't have a built-out analytics team in-house. I would actually say that analytics is so integral to all of this stuff, and to be honest, not even just really to content investment, kind of to all the marketing that you do, that it probably is worth getting an analytics consultant in to help you at least set up your tracking. If you're a business of a scale where you can afford to invest in data, then you should be investing in data above all else. But yeah, if you're a smaller brand, then maybe try and get an analytics consultant in just on a consultancy basis or something like that. Cool. So I think that's all the questions for now. And that is the webinar over, so you're free to go. But yeah, if you do have any more questions, then that's my email address. Feel free to get in touch anytime. And thank you very much for coming.